Hey, book lovers. My name is Em, and I want to talk about books. And cats. Hey, book lovers, welcome back. I have had another week that was mostly filled with editing and writing, so that's been pretty good. It can get a little confusing. I spent a good few minutes searching for this one specific part in the second book that I'm currently writing, and it took me a while to realize that the thing I was looking for was actually in the first book, the one that I'm editing. Whoops. Anyway, mostly I am finding it helpful to be working on both of them at once. I'm just really loving my writing projects right now. Things are flowing. I love it when that's the case. If you're into astrology or any of that stuff, it is a new moon in Pisces recently. We are in Pisces season, which is a very creative season. Speaking of writing, I have a new collection of short stories that is out right now. It's called 3:33 a.m. and it features 6 horror stories. And you can find it on Amazon and also at frapmedia.com. I am also a Pisces. My birthday is next week. So if you would like to give me a birthday gift and check out one of my books, I would be so grateful. Okay, shameless self-plug over. So this episode is going to be a lot like last week's. There are zombies and romance, books, and a movie. But this one also stems from one of my all-time favorite classics. And don't get me started on classics anyway. But I went through a Jane Austen phase when I was back in my teens and 20s, and Pride and Prejudice was above all my favorite of her books. Anyway, I'm not talking about Pride and Prejudice today, but from this book came Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which I instantly loved the title, but I really wanted to dislike this book, mostly because I was a snobby book person back then. Honestly, though, I loved it. It was really well done, and the zombies fit right into the existing plot quite well. Plus, it made Elizabeth Bennet even more of a badass than she already is. And she's like one of my favorite female characters. In a bit, I am going to talk about the movie version of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I just watched it, and it was excellent. Even better than I thought it was going to be, so that was good. But I'm also not discussing that quite yet, because I found something else one day. I took my kids to a used bookstore. This was years ago now. I was just thinking about it. It feels like it wasn't that long, but it was way before COVID. So my kids were young and now they're teenagers and almost out of high school. So it's been a while. But while we were there, I found this book and I bought it, but then never read it. I sometimes buy books and then they kind of get lost in the shuffle of my never-ending to-read pile. You know how it is. But I finally read it, and today I'm going to talk about it. I want to discuss the prequel to Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Dawn of the Dreadfuls by Steve Hockensmith. So I was really not sure what to expect from this one. A prequel written after the fact, especially after a spoof on a classic novel, it could go wrong in a lot of different ways. But luckily, this one did not disappoint. The beginning was rough, mostly because I despise the character of Mrs. Bennet, and I was kind of worried that she was going to be more involved in the plot than I wanted. She was not. This book starts out at a funeral. The corpse sits up, and everyone realizes that the unmentionables are back. Apparently, polite society doesn't use the Z word, or the Z word, as the book said, and I just love that. I wish Americans used Z instead of Z. Anyway. The zombies are back, and it's only a matter of time before they overrun their town. Mr. Bennet unearths his old dojo and begins to train his daughters immediately in the deadly arts. He was once part of a specialized warrior group who trained in Tokyo, and they helped handle the last surge of zombies. They thought they had wiped them out completely, but apparently not. He took an oath to raise his children as warriors, but he ended up breaking it to placate his obnoxious wife. So the training does not start off well. But then Master Hawksworth shows up. He was sent to help with training the Bennets, and he soon whips the girls into fighting shape. It's not ladylike, but the Bennett girls are a force to be reckoned with, and they are absolutely fearless. The thing I find funniest about these books is the contrast of a classic romance in the midst of zombies. It's just absurd. It works really well. For all of Mrs. Bennet's wailing and whining, her girls have no lack of prospects for marriage. In this one, there are quite a few. Jane has caught the eye of a truly disgusting lord. He's wealthy, and her father needs the use of his massive estate to fight the zombies, so unfortunately, Jane must go and stay in his home as his protector, and he gets rather pushy and kind of skirts the edge of appropriateness. He's gross. Jane has another admirer, a lieutenant in the army. A small regiment of 100 young soldiers has been sent up to help them fight the zombies, and the lieutenant is very honorable and kind of a true hero in this story, but there isn't much else to his character. He's kind of uptight. Elizabeth is also juggling a couple of admirers. The master seems to be strangely fascinated by her and has kind of hinted about his feelings for her. And she also meets a handsome young doctor who is fascinated by the zombies and wants to study them. He even goes as far as to capture one and experiment on it. He thinks that he can somehow turn the zombies back into human beings, which is an interesting theory. I'm not going to go into the plot, but let's just say that things don't go well for anyone in love with the Bennett girls in this book, which you already know because, Pride and Prejudice. But honestly, it doesn't ruin the story to know those things. It was pretty excellent. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. There's also this character who is an army captain, and he's secretly wooing Mrs. Bennet because apparently he was in love with her once before. But now he is just a torso. He has lost all of his limbs to zombie bites and has 2 men that serve as his limbs. It was such an absurd character, but it really added to the story. He was definitely one of my favorites. So like I said, this was a surprisingly good read. I would definitely recommend Dawn of the Dreadfuls by Steve Hockensmith. And I would recommend Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, too. And regular Pride and Prejudice if you somehow haven't read that one and you like a good romance. So now I want to talk about the movie version of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I avoided watching this at first. I'm not really sure why. But I'm so glad that I finally watched this one because the movie was fantastic. I love that Jane Austen style of romance. I love zombie movies. And I love action movies. And this one has all 3, plus it's funny. It was so good. And it was really beautiful. I really loved the cinematography and the combination of the period clothing and the weapons. And I just love a good sword fight. The fight choreography was just fantastic. The action scenes had everything you could want. They even had riding away or through, I guess, an explosion, but on horseback. It was so badass. I will say that the guy playing Darcy was just so convincingly awkward. It was almost painful to watch, but just really well done with the acting. And it also has Matt Smith in it. He plays Parson Collins, who is honestly one of the worst characters in the books. He's just smug and so annoying, but Matt Smith plays him so just hilariously awful and clueless. It was really good. Overall, this was a really enjoyable movie, and I would definitely recommend. So now it's time for the quote of the week, and I thought it would be funny to try and find a zombie-related quote, and then I quickly fell down a bit of a rabbit hole. Now, I enjoy a good zombie movie, but I've never really looked too deeply into the zombie lore. There are just other monsters that I personally find more interesting. So I try to find a zombie quote, and I immediately see a bunch of different versions of the same question. What is the zombie metaphor? So I hadn't really thought about this at all. So I did a little more reading, and I'm going to share a bit with you now. So for 80 years, the undead have been used by filmmakers and writers as a metaphor for much deeper fears. Racial sublimation, atomic destruction, communism, mass contagion, globalism. Zombies have represented the deeper social and political themes since their introduction to popular culture. It started out referencing slavery, but it has evolved over the years to represent anxieties regarding the Nazis, the fear around nuclear weapons, and racial tensions in the West, among other things. And you can really see how the evolution of zombie movies addresses the various issues of the times. It's a cool way to look at zombie movies, really, and not something that I had considered before. I love that there are so many different ways that people think and create. I love that there's so much depth to a zombie movie, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it is time for a new chapter of my own creation, my weekly writing project, which is Book 2 of the Verdant Valley series and currently titled Ocean Eyes. This week is Chapter 17. Enjoy. Lizault took the steaming mug that Nika held out to him. He sat on the edge of his bed, laden with green silk sheets, and took a deep inhale of the sweet, tangy scent wafting up from the pale golden liquid. He grinned a little with anticipation. Nika kneeled behind him on the bed and began massaging his shoulders. Flying made his muscles tense, and his back always ached with knotted tension. His new bride was trained in massage as well as natural magics and healing, and she had introduced him to the fragrant bedtime drink. He wasn't entirely sure what was in it, but Nika drank it nightly, and he trusted her. She was perhaps the only one he did trust completely. He had trusted her enough to confess his problem, the endless sleepless nights that threatened to make him go mad. Her reaction was calm and even. He'd rarely seen her look any other way. She silently poured some of the precious drink from her own cup and passed it to him. He drank it immediately. He had been so desperate for sleep that he didn't even consider that there was a chance of poison. Blissful sleep swept him away into a safe, quiet darkness. Dreamless sleep. Even better. Lizault's dreams were always of war, death, and destruction. Blood and shadows. Horrendous creatures that haunted his thoughts even in the daylight. Now he craved the quiet emptiness of night. Life had slowed to a peaceful, dull routine that he had never even known was possible. He knew most of his forest dwellers by name now. He spent his days working his way through the forest homes and spending quality time with his people. Many had fled the forest once the peace tree took root. Everything seemed to change overnight, and suddenly no one wanted to be associated with the children of death. They went from heroes to pariahs with startling rapidity. Just a few hundred remained, his loyal followers, the ones who understood what they had prevented. They trusted him to keep them safe. Lizault hid from his infamy and used the time to build up his own magical resources and fortify the forest's protection. So far, the peace tree had not affected the western forest. The shockwave Nim's message created had been felt all over. Even in their safe little city in the trees, Lizault and the others felt it. People stopped to look at each other with looks of fear, confusion, and knowing. Lizault felt it like a stone in his gut. Absolute dread. It was starting again. After centuries of peace, he didn't know if he had the energy to fight whatever was coming. What would happen to his kind and loyal subjects? What would happen to Nika? The only thing he had known was that he had to get to his long-lost buddy before he could reach Nim. Maybe he could make Kevo understand. They could team up and refuse to fight. They would be safe in the forest. He had no doubt about that. He had expected Kevo to immediately be on his side. He had wanted nothing to do with the magical realm and went on to have great success in the valley once the magic receded. He had assumed Kevo would want to stay clear of the whole thing. Lizault stared into his cup and watched the swirling trail of steam rising up from the golden surface. Nika's gentle touch held a magic of its own. He threw back the whole cup in one swallow and fell back onto his pillows. The warm, safe darkness was sliding over him, and he would soon be safely ensconced. Nothing could touch him in the darkness. Kevo lay awake staring at the green-patterned ceiling. He was in a room somewhere in the center of Lizault's lavish palace. He had seen numerous flybits hovering around the halls as he was led to his room. It dawned on him quite a bit later that they were security. Whether to keep him safe or to keep them safe from him, he wasn't sure. Maybe both. There were no windows, which made him think he was not near the exterior. It made him uneasy to think he was snug in a box somewhere and couldn't see the sun. He didn't entirely trust his dear old friend. Time had changed them both. How could it not? Especially with their curse of extended life. Kevo knew not all of his friends, accomplices, saw it as a curse, but he had never wanted any of it. He had no blood ties to any of them. He had been a pawn in their twisted game, volunteered unwittingly by the woman he had believed was his mother. Now he was going back into the mess. Lazalt still had not shared much about Nim's cryptic message or what was brewing in the shadows around the valley. Kevo knew something was up. He could feel it in the air. He was worried about Nim. They hadn't spoken in ages, but she was never far from his thoughts. Early on, they had spent a lot of time together. She was nervous about leading her people and rebuilding their community. She'd asked for his advice, and they had been working to find a way for her to balance river life and life on the land. They even made plans for a future together. However, once she got started, the rebuild took all of Nim's time and attention. Then she met Sephi, and Kevo had ceased to exist. Until now. When everything fell apart, she immediately called for him. After all this time. After what felt like an eternity, she expected him to just drop everything and come running to her aid. And he had. Or tried to, at least. He was sorely disappointed in himself. He had rehearsed so many speeches to her over the decades. He had practiced refusing. He didn't want to help her. He didn't want any of it. No one seemed to struggle the way he did. Maybe because they had magic in their blood. Maybe they were predisposed to almost eternal life and didn't notice the overwhelming drudgery. Kevo did. He'd learned not to develop relationships after a while. It was a hard lesson, watching everyone he cared for wither and die. He had said so many goodbyes, more than any normal person should have to. That was the first part of the curse. The second was far worse. He couldn't die. He'd tried over and over until the realization set in. Eternal life. The sisters had wanted it. The dark-hearted ones had unleashed a horrible darkness over the valley to try and attain it. The others didn't have any answers for him. They didn't have the same effects. Rhea had an incredible power of knowing, and she had returned briefly to the valley not too long ago. A few decades, maybe. Kevo was out for a run when she showed up at the gym. When he returned, she was seated behind the desk with her feet up. She was silently staring at Ronnie and the guys in the morning class. They were trying to ignore her, but he saw the looks of unease as he walked in the door. Rhea turned her eyes to him without moving. A small smirk played on her lips as she waited for him to get over his shock and speak. He didn't. The sinking dread he felt upon seeing her filled his veins with ice, and it became difficult to move. He motioned for her to follow him and stepped back outside. He turned his face to the warm sun, and it made him feel a little better. He had only a moment to recover, and then she was standing beside him. "Do you know who I am?" she asked after a long moment. Kevo nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. How could he have not known her? They had been together when the peace tree took root. They had staggered from the mansion soaked and confused, and split when Kevo returned to the valley, and Rhea and Martina left for good. Yet here she was. "I have something to tell you." His heart raced. A message from Nim, finally. He had spent ages trying to pretend he'd forgotten her. He'd even convinced himself, apparently. He was shocked at how his blood surged at the thought of a message from her. Rhea looked confused for a moment and then shook her head. No, that's not it. He had forgotten she could do that, read minds. When Allie still spoke to him, she had told him about the sisters, the ones he'd served without even knowing it, the one who'd pretended to be his mother. She'd also shared what she'd learned about the children of death. They had both been curious. They were outsiders in this messed-up family, but they were both manipulated into helping and received the same curse. Allie couldn't die either. She'd tried. Rhea grimaced beside him. Her sly countenance was gone, and she looked a little ill. "You've both suffered so much," she whispered. Kevo didn't respond. He tried to keep his mind blank. He hated the way she slipped into his private thoughts without even asking. It felt violating. "There's a cure," she continued. "In the river realm. I'm sure Nim could find the spell in the library." Kevo was frozen. His heart was no longer racing. Time seemed to slow down all around him as he took in her words. A cure. He turned and gave her a questioning look. He still didn't dare to speak. Something told him not to. River magic can wash anything clean. Anything, she emphasized. She walked away. Kevo suddenly couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only watch her. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers. Kevo's body went limp, and he collapsed to the ground. When he sat up, Rhea had vanished. He hadn't immediately been able to remember her words. Her presence was nothing more than a vague memory until a few days had passed, and Ronnie asked about her strange visit. It all came back at once. He tried to keep his face composed, but something shifted. Ronnie gave him a strange look and backed away. He didn't ask again. Kevo waited a while to tell Allie. They had become friends in the early days after the peace tree took root. Along with Lizault, they helped rebuild the valley. They were an inseparable trio for a time. Then the peace tree began to rapidly drain magic from the valley. Not just the remains of the darkness the dark-hearted ones had left behind, but all magic. Even the simple spells used by healers and grandmothers for centuries upon centuries. They lost their potency and faded away. There was a time of sickness and death that followed. It changed the entire landscape of the valley. The population declined sharply as the former healers figured out how to make up for the lost magic. Valley dwellers had become hardened and filled with rage. It had peaked at one point, and there had been fighting in the streets. The streets themselves were painted with blood, and the ones who remained were either vicious or cunning. The worst ones were both. Through it all, the Muscle House stood. Kevo taught whoever wanted to learn, and he attempted to bring confidence to the weaker students and calmness to the violent ones. The valley softened in time. The people were still stocky and strong. They liked to fight and were still quick to anger. They were survivors. At times, Kevo wondered if the peace tree was worth it. Absolutely nothing good had come from it, and now it was dying as the darkness crowded in overhead. It was just like before. Time had come back around. During his long life, Kevo had befriended very few. It was too difficult. He had never been good at making friends. He had only had Harper in school, and it turned out that that was by design. Lizault was the only real friend Kevo had, and they hadn't spoken in centuries. As the magic began to drain from the valley, he had flown away to take refuge in his forest. Somehow it remained protected amidst the long years of turmoil. Kevo hadn't seen his friend in a very long time. He lost Allie on the same day. Lizault left her crushed. She refused to leave the store on the hill. She claimed she still had something to do for Lottie, a promise she'd made to her when she was young. She begged Lizault to stay. She asked if she could come meet him later when her task was complete. In the end, he just left. He walked out of the store without a word and flew away. Allie ran after him for a while, and Kevo followed. He knew they couldn't catch his winged friend, but he wanted to be there for Allie when she finally gave up. He was kind of in shock that Lizault had just left both of them behind. Allie ran all the way to the border of the western forest before she stopped. Kevo was in excellent shape, but even he was cramped and breathing hard. Allie was breathing heavily and turning her head from left to right, assessing what she saw. Then she turned to Kevo with eyes that were as wild as her hair. "Well," she snarled, "do something." Kevo had never seen her like this. She seemed possessed, like a cornered animal, tense and dangerous. She was referring to the thick greenish fog that collected around the perimeter of the forest. Kevo had never seen it so thick before. The trees on the edge of the forest were mere shadows in the gloom. "You know there's nothing we can do. Someone would have to let us through." Allie's face crumpled. She let out a wail that shook Kevo deeply. The anguish was palpable. Her knees gave out and she fell to the ground. She rocked back and forth, wailing and coming disturbingly close to the fog. It seemed to reach toward her, inching closer. "Allie," Kevo said softly. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were shining and unfocused. She gave him a rageful cry and leapt at him. Her nails raked down either side of his face, leaving long, bloody gashes on both cheeks. Kevo pushed her away. Allie stumbled back, gathered herself, put her head down, and ran at him again. He sidestepped her, and she passed him without making contact. Kevo spun around for whatever her next attack would be, but she just kept running. Kevo watched her disappear over a hill in complete disbelief. The world was going crazy, and something very bad was coming. Instead of immediately heading back to the Muscle House, Kevo continued to the river. He went to the same place every time, the place he first met her. If Nim wanted to see him, she would always look there. He waited late into the night. It was cold. He sat on a large piece of weathered driftwood. The trunk was shiny from years of rain and floodwaters polishing it smooth. It wasn't a particularly comfortable place to sit, but it was the best option along the river. He held out against the cold for as long as he could. Just as Kevo was about to leave, there was a splash in the darkness. The night was moonless, and he couldn't see a thing. His hearing was keen after hours sitting and listening to the babble of the river. He heard the sound of light footsteps on the stony riverbank. Kevo slipped from his seat. He hesitated, listening for any clue of who approached. A hand grabbed his, slim, delicate fingers intertwined with his thick, rough ones. His heart jumped. For an instant, he was transported back in time. He was young and clueless and fighting for his life over things he didn't understand. But then he remembered their final parting. It would not warrant this kind of gentle greeting. He was just beginning to understand when he felt fingernails digging into his hand. A second hand grabbed his throat with an equally painful grip and stole his breath. "I don't think you're supposed to be here," a voice hissed in his ear. The hand on his throat squeezed tighter. Kevo's lungs were burning. Then his attacker laughed and pushed him away. He stumbled back and fell onto the driftwood. Seffi stood before him, suddenly lit by a soft ball of light floating over her head. Kevo scowled at her, and she laughed again. "It's been a long time." Her smile vanished in an instant. "What do you want?" "I was nearby, and I thought..." Kevo's voice was a croak, and it hurt him to speak. "What did you think?" Seffi asked coldly, moving closer. Kevo pressed himself back against the driftwood, trying to get further away from her. "Did you think that you would show up unannounced, uncalled for, and just, what, happen upon Nim on the riverbank, pining away over you after all these years?" Seffi gave a short, sarcastic laugh. The ball of light dipped for a moment, casting her face in shadow. It gave it a skeletal look, and her eyes were black pits. Then she stood up straight and returned to normal. "Do you realize how long it's been?" Kevo nodded. "Ha! I bet you're the one who's been pining away all this time," she sneered. "You are so pathetic." He didn't respond. His throat hurt too much, and he also knew better than to let Seffi bait him into an argument. Plus, he couldn't really disagree with her. He wouldn't call it pining, but he wouldn't deny that Nim had never been far from his thoughts, no matter how long it had been. He left the river soon after, rejected, embarrassed, and angry. Seffi had not mentioned the last time he'd been there, but she didn't need to. His shame was always waiting in the shadows, waiting to make another appearance and devastate him all over again. He had not returned to the river after that. He went back to the valley only to find that Allie had locked up the store, put a closed sign in the window, and never opened again. He tried to visit her once, but she didn't answer the door. Kevo had no idea if she was even in the store. He never saw Allie after that day. In one terrible day, he lost his only two friends in the world and was reminded of the devastating day he lost Nim. He staggered back down the hill to the gym, but passed it and continued to the liquor store down the street. He carried his bag back to the gym, locked himself inside, and drank himself into a stupor. It was the only way he could forget, and there were so many things he didn't want to remember. Now as he lay in the dim light of his room in the palace, there was no escaping his thoughts. Nothing to dull the noise and help him sleep. The room felt suddenly suffocating, and he jumped out of bed. He needed a walk. Some fresh air would clear his head. He opened the door and tried to step out into the hall, but a large flybit in full armor blocked his way. "Sorry, sir," they buzzed. "No one's allowed in the corridors at night. You must remain in your room until the morning bell." "I just need some air." He tried to push past the guard, but they lifted a short sword and pressed the point against Kevo's shirt. It made a tiny cut in the fabric, and Kevo relented. "This is ridiculous. I just need a little air. My room is stuffy. It doesn't have any windows." The flybit smirked. "Yes, sir. I know." He used the sword to gently prod Kevo back into his room. "Now how about you get back in that nice soft bed of yours and get some sleep? It'll be morning before you know it." They swung the door shut before Kevo could respond. The sound boomed through the quiet corridors. Kevo remained rooted in place. He heard the guard resume their place in front of his door. Were they protecting him or making sure he didn't escape? And that is the end of Chapter 17, book lovers. I hope you enjoyed this romance and zombie-themed episode again. And if you did, please give the show a rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share it with your friends, because maybe they would like some books and cats chat too. You can check out my books and plays at frapmedia.com or on Amazon, including my newest short story collection, 3:33 a.m. I greatly appreciate the support. Take care of yourselves, book lovers. I hope you have a beautiful week. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep reading.
A Frap Media production.